Debate on a motion 18695 in the name of Michael Russell on avoiding a no-deal exit from the EU. I would invite members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today, the Scottish Parliament has the opportunity to add its voice to those from across these islands who are urging the Prime Minister to pull back from the brink of inflicting major damage on our country, our prospects and our reputation. There's no doubt that in less than 2 months' time, unless he is stopped, the Prime Minister intends to take Scotland and the UK out of the EU without a deal. To do so, he has executed a shabby sleight of hand by attempting to prorogue the Westminster Parliament in order to silence any opposition. But to their credit, many members of the House of Commons across parties, and including the Conservatives, though alas not the Scottish Conservatives, are working together to prevent him having his way. Presiding Officer, that situation is both a challenge and an example for each and every one of us here. As representatives of Scotland, chosen by Scottish voters, we have to decide who we stand with. Do we defend basic democratic principles, or do we crumble at the onslaught of the ultra-Brexit fanatics? My party is committed to stopping no deal. I know that other parties in this chamber are in the same position, the Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. The question today is, what will the Scottish Conservatives do? Do they stand for Scotland and for democracy, or for their UK leader and their UK party? Clearly, they are answering that already. Or for their UK leader and their UK party, and for nothing else. I hope, allow me to make some progress. I hope that when we come to decision time, we can present the unanimous view of a united Scottish Parliament. United in saying to the Prime Minister, you have no mandate for a no-deal Brexit. Under no circumstances should you inflict such damage on our people, and we condemn your suspension of the UK Parliament. Now, we may hear two arguments from the Tories today that attempt to defeat that important outcome. The first will be that the... I know, yes, of course.
Marjorie Fraser.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way at last. Three times, members in the House of Commons from the Scottish National Party voted down a withdrawal agreement that would have taken us out of Europe without risking no deal. If the withdrawal agreement... Deputy Presiding Officer.
Please let Mr Fraser speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Members want to intervene in my intervention. They're very welcome to do so. If the withdrawal agreement is reintroduced to the House of Commons, will members of the SNP now support it and avoid the no-deal Brexit that they claim is so important that they avoid? Will they do so?
Michael Russell.
I had, Presiding Officer, anticipated that might be the argument. I shall come to it in just a moment. Let me say, however, that the argument that we would undermine the Prime Minister's negotiating position is the first Tory argument. But let's be clear about that. The Prime Minister may have sent a negotiator to Brussels, but he sent nothing with him on which to negotiate. Because the Prime Minister's attention is non-negotiable. He wants the EU to cast aside Ireland, one of its member states, and imperil the Good Friday Agreement in order to placate the DUP and his faction of hardline Brexiteers. Even his Attorney General has told him that that is impossible. Perhaps even his brother has told him that too. So if the Tories argue that what happens here will weaken Boris Johnson's hand, that isn't true, because there is nothing in his hand. Now, we may also hear, and indeed we've heard it from Mr Fraser, that the problem lies in the opposition benches, because the SNP and Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens refuse to vote for a May's deal, and therefore there can only be a no deal. Now, it would be churlish perhaps to point out to Mr Fraser, but I shall point it out, that actually more Tory MPs voted against the May deal than SNP MPs. But actually that would be true. Yet the real answer to his point lies in the reality of what Brexit will do. Brexit will make the people of Scotland poorer and cut this country off from the European mainstream. And the SNP will never vote for that. The deal negotiated by the previous Prime Minister would have taken Scotland and the UK out of the single market and the customs union. That dreadful outcome doesn't become tolerable just because another Prime Minister is now threatening us with something even worse. In line with both the result of the referendum in Scotland in June 2016 and subsequent repeated votes in this Parliament, the Scottish Government believes the future well-being and prosperity of Scotland and the UK as a whole is best served by staying in the European Union, which means staying in the single market and the customs union. We did argue, of course, in Scotland's Place in Europe publication in 2016, that a compromise might be found, which would have retained such membership of the largest and most lucrative market in the world, which provides Scotland's businesses with unrestricted access to over 510 million people. And others took that stance too. Indeed, in this chamber, the week after the EU referendum, Adam Tompkins said this: "Leaving the EU's political institutions does not mean that we have to leave the EU's single market, for there are several countries, including Norway, that have just such an arrangement." Now, I agree with Mr Tompkins. The EU's four freedoms, the free movement of goods, services, capital and people, have for decades brought huge advantages to Scotland. Inward migration has made an overwhelmingly positive contribution to our economy and society. If the number of EU citizens coming to live in Scotland halves, the projected growth in the working age population of Scotland would be reversed. In our health and social care sector, we will simply not be able to care for our sick and elderly people if we cannot attract and keep the dedicated staff we need, so many of whom have come from EU countries. Our economy and our society have gained enormously from the opportunity, based on shared values, to trade freely with the expansive community of nations on our doorstep. At a time when climate change, tackling inequality and adopting new technology whilst creating future jobs are all key challenges, Scotland is well placed to benefit from and contribute to shared European endeavour. And in a world where intolerance and isolation appear to be on the rise, now more than ever, it's essential we work to further the EU's founding values: respect for dignity and human rights, freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law. We must not turn our backs on them. So in our horror at the prospect of no deal, we shouldn't accept for a second that leaving the EU and leaving the single market and customs union is justified. We continue to believe there should be a new EU referendum in which the SNP will campaign for Remain. For any hard Brexit outside the single market and the customs union will be costly and deeply damaging. It's a measure of how awful a no deal would be that the costs and effects of such a chaotic Brexit would actually be even more severe. The UK's government's own evidence tells us that a no-deal exit would result in an economic shock with a significant impact. But in fact, Presiding Officer, nobody knows the full extent of the damage that would result in Scotland's and the UK's interests being damaged, nor how long it would last. We do know it would cause real problems for every citizen in every part of Scotland. And it should therefore be clear to us all that a no-deal Brexit is an outcome which no sensible person could contemplate, let alone actively promote. Now, of course, the Scottish Government has been engaging with all sectors of our society, from exporters and rural communities to the National Health Service and the police, to try and mitigate or manage the worst effects of a no-deal exit. We'll do everything we can to make a difference, but we'll not be able to do everything. In our preparations, we're prioritising activity in areas that will be heavily impacted by Brexit, such as transport, food and drink, medicines, agriculture and the marine economy. We're working with business organisations, local authorities and the third sector. But the stark reality is that the UK is not and cannot be completely or fully ready for a no-deal EU exit on October the 31st or any other date. Moreover, that same UK government is making matters worse by failing to engage with the devolved administrations. In the run-up to 29th March, there was considerable cooperation and consultation between our governments. No, I won't, not in this moment. I have to make this point, and then I will. We disagreed on policy, but both sides knew we needed to work together. The new UK government has a different approach. Now, it could be that they are simply disorganised, or it may be that they are deliberately keeping the devolved administrations in the dark in order to try and blame them when things go wrong. Let me tell the Chamber how difficult this situation has now become. At the end of July, the new UK administration introduced a revised committee structure to oversee EU exit. We were assured that devolved administrations would be invited to take part where the agenda required it, as we had been in the equivalent structures during the May Premiership. We understand that there have now been at least 26 meetings of the new EXO committee, responsible for overseeing preparations for no deal, yet Scottish Government ministers have been invited to only 2. If these meetings are indeed intended to prepare the UK for Brexit, then we must assume that important matters relating to health, justice and public order, immigration, transport and many other areas would be discussed. Yet the devolved administrations have not been asked to take part. Then there is the issue of the Yellowhammer documents, recently the subject of media coverage. In the past, we've seen the versions of these as they developed and changed, and we need to do so as the planning assumptions are always developing and changing. We know that process continues, but the last version we saw was dated the 7th of August, almost a month ago. The Prime Minister told the First Minister when he met her in Bute House on the 29th of July that he would host a JMC plenary very shortly. It hasn't yet happened, and no date is set. The first meeting of the JMC EN since the change of government also hasn't yet taken place, but it's now scheduled for a week today. We will see if it happens. We also await response to a significant number of letters from my Cabinet Secretary colleagues to their UK government counterparts on matters of pressing concern. Over July and August, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and the Minister for Public Health between them issued a number of letters about urgent priorities, including no-deal issues. There has as yet been no response. Nor has the Cabinet Secretary for Justice had a response from the Home Secretary about how the UK proposes to manage the loss of access to key EU databases and systems essential to the effective operation of our police forces. I could go on with examples in the rural economy and across other crucial areas, but let me finish on this. Members will no doubt be aware of the UK government's Get Ready for Brexit campaign. However, details of this campaign, which is running in Scotland, were only shared with the devolved administrations after it was launched by Michael Gove on Sunday. That, presiding officer, is a reality about the intense liaison with the Scottish Government the UK Government claims to be undertaken. Presiding officer, today's motion isn't controversial. Whatever Scotland's constitutional future we believe in, it's in no one's interest to leave the EU in chaos without a deal. For the final irony is that a no-deal Brexit does not mean the end of the Brexit process. The Scottish Tories have certainly been on a journey. Most didn't want to leave the EU. They then told us that the overriding priority was to stay in the single market. Then they insisted we must accept Theresa May's deal, which would take Scotland out of the single market. And now, are they really going to tell us to give up on democracy too, all in the service of a Brexit that Scotland didn't vote for and which isn't supported across this chamber? We all have different ambitions for Scotland's future. It's no surprise that mine is independence within the EU. But a no-deal Brexit would be chaos for everyone. It will mean starting all over again from a much worse position outside the EU with all influence gone. All the issues that bedeviled the long three-year process to date will still have to be addressed. A trade agreement, migration, citizens' rights, a financial settlement. The so-called clean break isn't a clean break at all. It's a messy fit of petulance, the consequences of which will haunt us for years. So whatever divides us, let's unite today. Come together and send a message to the Prime Minister. Presiding officer, that message is that under no circumstances, should the UK leave the EU without a deal. That is what my motion says, and I commend it to the Chamber.
I now call on Donald Cameron to speak to and move Amendment 18695.1. For 7 minutes, please, Mr Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. May I start by both moving the amendment in my name and by paying tribute to Jackson Carlo and Adam Tompkins, who have spoken on Europe and external affairs for these benches in the past, both hard acts to follow. Before turning to the issues around no deal, I will, if I may, briefly address the subtext, so the part of the Scottish Government's motion about prorogation, because there have been various assertions made in the last week that the UK Government is somehow subverting democracy, repeated today. Now, we've heard much hyperbole about dictatorship in the last week or so, including the First Minister's ridiculous suggestion that the UK Government might even abolish this Parliament, with the implication that the guardians of democracy are instead the SNP. This from a government whose commitment to democracy involves rejecting the result of not just one, but 2 referendums. This from a government whose own referendums bill has been criticised by witnesses at committee as without equivalence in well-functioning parliamentary democracies. And this from a government which routinely ignores votes expressing the will of this Parliament whenever it suits them. So let's have no more lectures on democracy from the SNP, Presiding Officer. Yes.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. He speaks as though the criticism of the UK government and its behaviour has come only from those of us on the pro-independence side, or only from those outside the Conservatives. If the Conservative MSPs in this chamber were working under the constraints of a Boris Johnson whip, how many of them do you think would have been purged by now?
Donald Cameron.
Well, the short answer, presiding officer, is we're not operating under a Boris Johnson whip. Now, in terms of no deal, can I set out the basic principles of our position? The Scottish Conservatives have consistently said we should respect the result of the referendum for the UK to leave the EU. We have always seen a negotiated exit from the EU as the best outcome and the best way to deliver on the referendum result. That was the position in March when these benches supported Theresa May in her attempts to get the withdrawal agreement through Parliament. And it is true now. We support the UK government's policy to reach a deal with the EU, and given the recent comments of EU leaders, such as Angela Merkel, we believe this remains a realistic outcome. And I disagree with the Cabinet Secretary, not least because there have been talks at a technical level in Brussels only yesterday. David Frost, the UK government's representatives in these talks, has been in the EU capital with a full negotiating team exploring various proposals. And the UK government remains committed to leaving the EU with a deal, and indeed to securing a deal to leave at the European Council on October the 17th. I will give way to Mr. Russell.
Michael Russell.
I'm quite sure the member whom I welcome to his new role believes what he has said, but I wonder if he would then want to contradict the official spokeswoman of the European Commission, who said this morning, this is Mina Andreeva, the official spokesperson, that the British government has made no proposals for ending the Brexit deadlock ahead of a new round of technical talks. So does he disagree with her, or is she lying?
Donald Cameron.
As he said, there are discussions ongoing, negotiations continue. Now, presiding officer, undoubtedly, time is running out. We are nearing the end, but there is still a good chance that a deal will be struck, and that is where efforts are rightly concentrated. Now, I don't have time, I'm afraid. Even at this point in time, a deal is achievable. And a deal is not just achievable, it is also desirable. This spring, organisations across Scotland wanted a deal. Scottish business wanted a deal. Scottish exporters wanted a deal. Scottish farmers wanted a deal, and there is no reason to suppose that has changed. We have always sought a negotiated exit from the EU, as demonstrated by the fact that in the third meaningful vote, all 13 of our MPs supported the withdrawal agreement. They were the only Scottish MPs to do so, and to prevent no deal by voting for that agreement. So it was particularly grating, presiding officer, to hear the First Minister say on Tuesday that SNP MPs will do everything within their power to stop the UK leaving without a deal. Well, let me tell her, there is one very simple way to do that. Get her MPs to back a deal. Three times the SNP and others had an opportunity to back a deal earlier this year, and 3 times they failed to do so. Such a deal achieved their key demands.
Excuse me, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Cameron is coming to the end of his remarks very soon, so please give him some quiet to so do. Donald Cameron.
Thank you. 3 times the SNP and others had an opportunity to back a deal earlier this year, and 3 times they failed to do so. Such a deal achieved their key demands: frictionless trade, a transition period, protecting citizens' rights, and crucially, no hard border on Ireland. And by voting against the deal, they bear some of the responsibility for bringing no deal closer. Now, let me turn specifically to the issue of no deal and its impacts. As a party, we have never actively pursued no deal as an outcome in and of itself, although we have always accepted that it is a possibility, and that was made clear in our manifesto 2 years ago. We want to avoid no deal, and that is why we believe we must continue to pursue a negotiated exit. Now, let me acknowledge some of the points made by the Cabinet Secretary about the impact of no deals, and he knows the respect which I have for him on this and other matters, because I believe, speaking personally, And I've always believed that a no-deal Brexit should be avoided, given the effects it would have. And there are friends of mine on these benches, some of whom will speak after me, who may take a more robust approach than I do. And there is a spread of opinion. There always has been, and we are entirely comfortable with that. But the opposite of no deal is a deal. The route to an orderly departure from the EU is via a deal. And if the Cabinet Secretary and his party truly want to prevent no deal, then they should support the UK government in achieving that. That is where all our energy should be directed, at this, the 11th hour. And I urge him and his party, in the interest of Scotland, to support a deal. And if the SNP and others fail to support a deal, and no deal becomes the reality, then we will accept that, and we shall all have to live with the consequences.
I now call on Alex Rowley for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening for Labour today, I would like to state our support for the motion brought forward by the Government. We are clear that a no-deal Brexit must not be allowed to happen, and Labour is doing and will continue to do everything we can to stop such a scenario from happening. We also condemn the suspension of Parliament by Boris Johnson. It is obvious to all that this is simply a ploy to block proper democratic scrutiny. It is it not ironic that the very people who talked about taking back control and restoring sovereignty to Parliament are the very same people who are now shutting Parliament down? We must appreciate the dangers of allowing any leader to shut down our democratic processes just because they cannot get their own way. Democracy might at times seem difficult, but we should be clear it is far better than anything I have seen around the world, and we disrespect it at our peril. And that is why this Parliament here in Edinburgh, today must condemn the actions of Boris Johnson and his cabal, who are demonstrating a total disregard for our democracy. Boris Johnson cannot be allowed to crash us out of the European Union, throwing the country under his infamous Brexit bus in order to pursue an ideological, hard-right project which will only benefit himself and the wealthy donors to the Tory party. There will be no benefits for hard-working people, hard-working families, when the cost of living runs out of control. The Tories refused to publish their impact assessment that was asked for on how a no-deal Brexit would affect poverty levels in this country. The Poverty Alliance, based in Glasgow, are right to highlight this issue. And is it not a scandal that their Freedom of Information requests were refused from the Department of Work and Pensions, who stated it would not serve the public interest to release that information? I've got to ask the Scottish Tories in this chamber, where do your priorities lie? Your country, your party, or your career? Our path is clear. The legislative process against this disastrous no-deal plans are underway, and we will support a vote to call a general election so the people can decide. We will support a vote to call a general election so the people can decide our country's future once the bill to stop no deal is law. But this option will only be pursued when we can guarantee no deal is off the table. As Ken Clarke, the former Tory Chancellor, said yesterday, and I quote, "I do think the Prime Minister has a tremendous skill in keeping a straight face while he is being disingenuous." In other words, you cannot trust a word Boris Johnson says. The man is a stranger to the truth. But what of the Scottish Tories, or should I say the Scottish Conservative and Brexit Party? Not one of their MPs, under the threat of expulsion from the Tory party, had the conviction to stand up for Scotland and oppose a no-deal Brexit. and we should be under no illusions. The impact of a no-deal Brexit will be devastating for Scotland, indeed devastating for the whole of the United Kingdom. I understand that people are fed up with Brexit. I understand they just want it to be over with. But it will not be over with if we crash out on Halloween without a deal. The nightmare will just begin. The National Union of Farmers have warned no deal would be a disaster for agriculture. The Royal College of Physicians, health leaders and indeed the UK Government itself, presiding officer, have all warned of the risk of food and medicine shortages. And the TUC are explicit about the threat to our economy, to jobs and the threat to hard-won workers' rights. And as Jeremy Corbyn said this week, a no-deal Brexit is really a Trump-deal Brexit, leading to one-sided US trade deal that will put us at the mercy of Donald Trump and big American business. This is not what the people voted for in 2016, and that is why we must go back to the people so that they can make an informed decision based on the facts. And I want to be clear, Remain must be an option on that ballot paper. Scottish Labour will support and campaign for Remain. Remain and reform within inside Europe, alongside Remain and reform within the United Kingdom. For the fundamental question is, what best meets the needs and aspirations of the Scottish people? Nobody voted for food shortages or job losses. We must continue to do everything in our power to resolve the Brexit crisis. And when no deal is securely taken off the table, Labour will give the people the option to have their say. Thank you.
Before we move on, I did hear some name-calling during the contribution from Mr Rowley. Can I say I wish all members to treat other members with respect, and I don't believe name-calling from seated positions and loud voices is appropriate in this chamber. I call Ross Greer for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The last few weeks, and in particular the last 48 hours, have seen a level of chaos descend on Westminster that even those of us using the most imaginative rhetoric in 2014 could scarcely have suggested. Phrases like constitutional crisis are overused in UK politics, but that's exactly what we're now in the grips of. Britain's executive and legislature are at a level of conflict that we just haven't seen in the modern era. A conflict that's now playing out not just in Parliament and in the media, but in the courts, both in Edinburgh and in London. The days where we described events like the 2011 pasty tax budget as an omnishambles seem almost quaint. Not because that era of Conservative austerity was anything other than a cruel disaster inflicted on the most vulnerable, but simply because the current Johnson administration has combined every one of the British ruling class's worst characteristics at their most acute moment of crisis. The arrogance, the incompetence, the contempt, and the inability to understand that they can't have it their own way all the time. The failure to understand that this isn't a parlour game being played by old Eton chums. And the tolerance for parliamentary democracy only until it starts to get in their way. The British state and the British political class are tearing themselves asunder. And on one level, I can't pretend to be anything other than delighted that the corporate and populist wings of the Conservative Party are locked in a fight to the death. If only they could both lose, the people of this country would be the real winners. But the decision to suspend the Westminster Parliament in an attempt to force no deal is an affront to democracy. And we now know that this was being planned for weeks while the government were lying in denial after denial to Parliament and to the press. This is the behaviour of authoritarians, not democrats. And it has shown the British Constitution to be wildly unfit for purpose. In what normal democracy can an unelected monarch suspend an elected Parliament on the request of a government without majority support? Though I have to take my hat off to the Brexiteers, by the time this ends, they might have destroyed the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, popular support for the monarchy, and the union itself. And we see the shameful spectacle of government ministers adopting the language of nationalist authoritarians as they suggest they could ignore laws passed by Parliament. We're faced with a Prime Minister lashing out wildly as he tries to cling on, supported, it appears, to the last by the Scottish Conservative MPs. Yes.
Neil Findlay.
I think he's making an excellent speech, and I agree with a great deal of what he said. On the Constitution, I think he is right in terms of many of the things he said. But actually, if we look at how the House of Commons operated this week, the House of Commons exerted its power over the executive this week. So in that regard, Parliament worked. My fear is that if we had a situation in this Parliament where the government was doing something outrageous, then that would not prevail.
Ross Greer.
I think Mr Findlay makes a fascinating point for a separate theoretical discussion about the constitutional setup in this Parliament. The reality is the UK Parliament has had to fight a last-minute, final-ditch effort against its own suspension by an executive that is out of control. I mean, we've moved beyond lies and deceit and demonising opponents as traitors. We've now moved into the territory of a government that is deliberately trying to override Parliament, despite lacking support for doing so. As if this dangerous turn in British politics is not bad enough in and of itself. It's all in pursuit of allowing the UK government to drive the country headfirst into a no-deal Brexit. We've heard many of its predicted impacts already, but it really can't be emphasised enough how devastating this would be. The UK would face shortages of medicines, particularly those that just can't be stockpiled for any significant length of time. This is a severe risk for anyone in the UK that relies on medication to control or treat conditions that they have. It is genuinely life-threatening. It's already caused a huge amount of anxiety. People with cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, people already having to deal with serious health conditions made to suffer even more uncertainty. And what's the government's response? Leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, when questioned on no-deal mortality rates by a respected doctor who was involved in drawing up the government's own Operation Yellowhammer no-deal planning, accused the man of being a Ramoner. The government is turning on its own professional advisers because they dare to tell the truth and they dare to question the government's rhetoric. There would also be shortages of food. The Conservatives have repeatedly sought to assure us that there would be sufficient food. But there isn't sufficient food for millions of people in the UK right now. An estimated 8.5 million people struggle to eat enough week by week in one of the richest nations on earth. Millions rely on food banks, often after suffering directly at the hands of callous Tory benefit sanctions. How will these people fare under a no-deal Brexit? Food bank charities already rely on donations, on the goodwill of others. How long will that last when the shelves start to go empty, when the price of food spikes? All of these consequences are the result of a government pursuing a policy that they just don't have a mandate for. For the Prime Minister, it's just a means to the only end that's ever mattered to him, staying in power for as long as he can. Throughout the EU referendum, we were told repeatedly by the leaders of the Leave campaign that voting to exit the European Union would not mean leaving without a deal. No-deal Brexit wasn't on that ballot. Now, I commend MPs in Westminster who have fought directly against the UK government's attempts to subvert democracy. I suppose there had to be something that Winston Churchill's grandson and I agreed on eventually. But their efforts to enact a bill prohibiting no-deal are vital. Once that's done, I look forward to seeing the Conservatives tossed out of power and the damage they've done to this country reversed, and the final verdict on Brexit being given back to the people in a referendum. Ultimately, though, whatever the actions of the majority of MPs at this moment, the crisis in Westminster has demonstrated that Scotland is not safe in this union. The Greens will work with others and exhaust every option to stop a no-deal Brexit, to stop Brexit entirely, and to rid us of this disastrous government, and to give Scotland the say over our own future that is now so clearly needed.
Now Colin Willie-Rennie, 6 minutes, please.
Donald Cameron seems to be one of the few Conservatives left supporting Theresa May's deal. It wasn't me, Mike Russell, or even Alex Rowley's MPs who blocked that deal. It wasn't us on our own. It wasn't possible for us to do it on our own. It was his own new Prime Minister who blocked that deal, and his colleagues in the ERG. So don't blame us. Blame your own party. The own party which is divided and has divided this country for decades on this issue. You should accept your responsibility for this mess. It will be a useful event for this Parliament to stand together to send a clear message to Boris Johnson that we join people across the United Kingdom who are deeply concerned by the prospect of a no deal. I wanted to believe Boris Johnson was striving for a deal with Europe. Ruth Davidson, last week, I thought she made quite a convincing case that she believed Boris Johnson was striving for a deal. But the Prime Minister has moved. He's moved quite significantly from saying no deal was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance during the leadership contest, now to touch and go. But it's pretty clear, I think, that the Prime Minister's actual goal is no deal. But why on earth would he want such an event? The Yellowhammer reports, his own reports, are very, very clear. Even if only 1/10 of those predictions become true, it will be an enormous hit on the country. Food shortages, lorries backed up at the ports, price rises, medicine shortages. Take Anna Ruth Cockerham from my constituency. She's anxious. She has a chronic condition called functional neurological disorder, which results in chronic pain and seizures. She takes controlled medicine, which can only be prescribed at 28 days at a time. The lack of medication worsens her seizures, and the pain can last for weeks afterwards. Her prescription is due to be filled at the end of October. She worries about medicine shortages in the event of a no-deal Brexit. That's why she contacted me this very week. She's experienced shortages before and felt the effects, and that was without Brexit. She points out that the UK government's Get Ready for Brexit tool contains absolutely no information for patients in these circumstances. These are real-life impacts of a reckless Prime Minister and a reckless UK government. So why would the Prime Minister ever keep such a no-deal open as an option? I'm afraid that political interests have trumped the national interest. He has made, quite simply, a cynical calculation that he can get the votes of the Brexit Party behind the Conservatives. It seems that a no-deal Brexit is the only thing that would convince Nigel Farage. He is forging a pact with Nigel, and the Scottish Conservatives have bought it, hook, line and sinker. Forget the economy, forget prices, forget medicine shortages, and forget Anna Ruth Cockerham. Not one Scottish Conservative MP stood up against their Prime Minister's strategy in the Commons this week. Every single one of them buckled. They all put the party interest ahead of the national interest. So it is my hope that this motion today will add to the growing weight of opinion across the United Kingdom. It's not just in Scotland that the opposition is clear. It is strong and growing across the UK. But we need to stop Brexit altogether, not just a no-deal Brexit. And the sooner the Labour Party stand up and say so, the better it will be for the country. I've heard that Scottish Labour's position is apparently different, as was explained by Alec Rowley just a few moments ago. They say they're for Remain, but just like on independence, they have been completely unable to persuade their UK leader, Jeremy Corbyn. So we have the farcical situation that Labour in Scotland would campaign to remain in the EU, but a Jeremy Corbyn premiership would negotiate to leave. At this moment of national crisis, Labour must stand up and oppose Brexit. They will never be forgiven if they do not. The SNP joined us last year to back a people's vote to stop Brexit. We were pleased about that. It took a while, but they did the right thing. We stand together today to oppose a no-deal Brexit. But for goodness sake, will the SNP stop using Brexit to campaign for independence? Do they not realise that breaking up long-term economic partnerships is a pretty hard thing to do? Do they not realise that looking at the chaos of Brexit and concluding that we want some of that right here too is the wrong conclusion to reach? Do they not realise that there is another way to stop Brexit? Revoke a people's vote is growing in popularity. 1 million on the streets of London. 6 million signing that
sorry,
petition.
Mr Rennie. Mr Rennie's just closing. No interventions.
Thank you. So there was 1 million on the streets of London. 6 million signing that petition. And the power of a strong argument is building the pressure for Remain. To give up on those aspirations of millions of British people is cavalier and reckless and is not something the Liberal Democrats will ever do. But on a final point that I want to make, we are speaking with one voice today on the no-deal Brexit. We are backing Westminster. We are encouraging the House of Lords. We are telling the Prime Minister to stop. Stop a no deal and stop it absolutely right now.
Well said, Ray. Well said.
We'll now move to the open debate. Can I have some attention, please? Thank you. We will move to the open debate, and speeches of 6 minutes. Time is really tight, so please be concise. And I call Gillian Martin to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today is the chance for the Scottish Parliament to have its say in Boris Johnson's undemocratic and increasingly dictatorial plans for a no-deal Brexit. As we vote tonight, I think we should all, regardless of party, remember who it was that made it possible for each one of us to have the privilege of serving in this place, our constituents. We all have a duty to reflect their stated wishes with regard to leaving the EU. And as we know, there's not one council area in Scotland who had a majority to leave, deal or no deal. The people voted 62% in Scotland to remain, just a few weeks after they had made the decision to vote us in. Those who voted SNP did so knowing that we stood for in terms of Scottish independence and our desire to remain in the European Union. And the party who were able to form the main opposition, the Scottish Conservatives, made their pro-EU position clear, with only a handful of pro-Brexit exceptions. Those who voted Ruth Davidson in as the representative of Edinburgh Central did so after hearing her many forceful speeches in favour of remaining in the EU, long before the EU referendum. And it must be said, we all know stories of many who were convinced to vote no in the Scottish independence referendum because people like Ruth Davidson and others in this chamber warned them would be out of the EU. Just an hour ago, a guest of mine who came into the Parliament, came in to talk to me about fish health, was at pains to tell me that because of Brexit, he was now an independence supporter. And I hear this all the time back in my constituency. After all, my area of Aberdeenshire is set to be one of the worst hit economically due to any type of Brexit, and my constituents are rightly furious. I won't. But enough of the Tory rhetoric before the vote on June the 23rd, 2016. Let's look at the messaging from some of the prominent Tories in here as they came to terms with the fact that Scotland would be taken out of the EU as a result of that vote. On the 28th of June 2016, Adam Tompkins said, "To my mind, leave should mean that we retain full access to the EU single market. As I understand it, even the small number of MSPs who advocated a leave vote are of the view we should maintain as full access to the single market as is possible." End quote. In September of that year, he said, quote, "Being completely outside the single market would, in my view, be contrary to the British national interest." His comments were bolstered by his then leader, Ruth Davidson. She said on the 30th of June 2016, quote, "It was access to the single market and trade that was the very core of my support for the European Union because it helps our economy, it helps sustain jobs and helps to keep our public services in Scotland well funded. Retaining our place in the single market should be the overriding priority." And she reiterated that view again in September when she made exactly the same, December, when she made exactly the same points. Make no mistake, if the Scottish Tories reject this motion today, they are making an official declaration that they do not reject a no-deal scenario. Those Scottish voters who put their trust in them, based on the words they said, will remember... Yes, I will.
Oliver Mundell.
I thank the member for giving way, but I wonder if she remembers the 2017 general election, where I think that voters in her area elected a candidate who stood on a manifesto that made clear that there was a possibility of leaving the EU at least without a deal.
I'm actually really grateful for that intervention, because Colin Clark was a Remainer and is now turned into a Brexiteer. So I'm wondering how the people in my constituency... I'm not wondering actually how the people in my constituency feel about that. I know how they feel about that. They're asking me to complain. I'll come on to Colin Clark later. Presiding Officer, let me now turn to the issue of the so-called prorogation of the UK Parliament, or in plain English, which we are more fond of in this place, the suspension of Parliament by the current Prime Minister. We're looking at a 5-week suspension designed to allow Boris Johnson to leave the EU in a manner which will not be scrutinised by those elected to do so. After prompting by so many of my constituents, and here's where I come to Colin Clark, I wrote to Colin Clark, the MP for Gordon, who has recently been promoted to a junior ministerial post by Boris Johnson for his U-turn abilities. In answer to my concerns about the lack of scrutiny available to MPs in this most important of constitutional decisions, he said something very revealing by way of reply. He said this: "I honestly believe that the best outcome for the UK is a deal which the PM will now be able to pursue unencumbered on the 17th of October. Unencumbered. What does that mean for a parliamentary democracy if a Prime Minister can remove the so-called encumbrance of the scrutiny of MPs? It means he can do anything he likes. It sets that precedence forever. This is straight out of the despot playbook. Trump tried it with executive orders in the US, and Johnson is trying it out for size with the prorogation rules in Westminster. That's how it starts. You find a mechanism, you exploit it, and you have a path to subvert parliamentary democracy at will. And if we don't stop his first attempt now, we'll be opening the floodgates to totalitarianism. I urge everyone to reject those attempts, to reject a no-deal Brexit and to support the government motion tonight. And to the MSPs and the Tory benches, I hope you're able to vote with your conscience tonight rather than being whipped. But, Presiding Officer, even today at First Minister's questions, the Tories are ignoring all signs to the contrary and are making a good fist of pretending that they are convinced that Boris Johnson is pulling out all the stops to get a deal with the EU. Well, Mr Johnson's own Foreign Office civil servants are not convinced. We know that the negotiating team has been reduced. The member of the team said,
"You must close, please."
"Our team has basically been sent to Brussels to pretend to negotiate."
You must close, please, Miss Martin.
I asked them not to be bystanders as democracy is subverted.
Miss Martin, please sit down.
The people of Scotland will never forgive you.
Please sit down. Can I say to everyone here, I have told you how tight time is. People are going to disadvantage members of their own group who may be dropped from the speaking list if people go over time. Graham Simpson, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is the 34th debate we've had on Brexit in the course of this Parliament, the 34th afternoon of hot air filling this chamber, and the 34th time we will have a vote which will achieve precisely nothing. That's not to mention 25 statements of varying levels of usefulness and 29 committee inquiries. What have any of them achieved? Very little. What has marked the majority of that debating time has been the almost complete lack of a voice of anyone who believed in 2016 that Brexit would be a good thing, because most members said they wanted the UK to remain in the EU. I was one of only 6 who said before the vote that they wanted out, all Conservatives. And 1 million of our fellow citizens in Scotland agreed with us. Their voice has hardly been heard in this chamber since. The Scottish Parliament has not been representative of Scotland on this issue. So today, I speak for the million and I speak for democracy. For it was democracy, Deputy Presiding Officer, or lack of it, that led me to conclude with regret that the UK should leave the EU project. And it's democracy that leads me to say that the SNP motion today is completely wrong. Of course, when it was written by the Cabinet Secretary, we'd not witnessed the spectacle of the House of Commons riding roughshod over the will of the people, but we should have expected a Remainer Parliament with a partisan Speaker to do its bit to thwart the result of the referendum. The votes in the Commons this week have nothing to do with stopping no deal and everything to do with stopping Brexit altogether. What a disgrace. Now, when David Cameron called the referendum, he certainly never envisaged losing. But if you're going to call a referendum on anything, then you really must be prepared for any outcome and respect it. You don't respect it by repeatedly trying again until you get the result you want. And various figures in the SNP even recognise the dangers for them in doing that over the EU? Should Scotland ever vote for independence, including Alex Neil, Kenny Gibson and even Pete Wishart? I felt very let down by Mr Cameron when he resigned as Prime Minister. He should have swallowed his pride and got on with the job which he was good at. Theresa May, who also wanted to remain, told us that Brexit means Brexit. But of course it didn't, once we caved in and took the option of no deal off the table. Why would anyone take you seriously in a negotiation when you're not prepared to walk away? They don't and they haven't, which is why we still have the spectacle of Monsieur Barnier insisting the Irish backstop will remain. Every Conservative MP, including Philip Hammond, stood on a manifesto that said, we continue to believe that no deal is better than a bad deal for the UK. And that is my view. And given that Parliament has rejected the only deal on the table 3 times, then no deal really is all that's left or remaining. And as Ruth Davidson said in her dignified resignation press conference last week, those who have rejected the deal need to get behind a new deal when it comes. Members of my own party certainly do, if the Prime Minister succeeds in persuading the burghers of Brussels to shift. But what of the other parties? What, if any deal, would the SNP, the Greens, the Lib Dems or Labour be happy with? Do they even respect the referendum result? Certainly doesn't look like it. And if the people's vote to leave was overturned by the Westminster Parliament, what would the SNP think about that precedent being set? What if we had a situation where Scotland had voted for independence, only for a pro-union Parliament here to be elected, which then blocked it? Presiding officer, once you have a result in a referendum, you must act on it. The real threat to democracy is not a Prime Minister intent on giving the people what they voted for, but a cabal of preening, posturing politicians who are not the slightest bit interested in what the people think. Anyway, what is this no deal that people talk about? There are hundreds of agreements being reached on cross-border transport, airports, shipping, insurance and foreign residency status. Even, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Deputy Mayor of Calais admits there will be no hold-ups for British trucks. Finally, and I think I'm well within time, I would just ask this. If the situation was that Scotland had voted for independence, would the SNP ever be prepared to leave with no deal? And if so, what is it they're complaining about now?
Stuart McMillan, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I just want to touch upon Graham Simpson's comments for a moment. I thought it was a very helpful resume at the beginning of his contribution regarding the number of occasions this Parliament has actually spoken about Brexit and the implications of Brexit. I think it actually highlights how important this Parliament and this government actually feel about Brexit and the implications of Brexit, whether it's a deal or a no deal, certainly on all of the constituents across the country. And on the second point regarding democracy, I have to remind Mr Simpson that 62% of the population of Scotland voted to remain. Voted to remain. Now, 62%, that's what this Parliament is actually doing. It's talking about the issues that really matter to the population of Scotland and also highlighting the issues regarding the implications of Brexit, whether it's a deal or a no deal. Now, Presiding Officer, historians will be writing about the events of Brexit for decades to come, but in that, how many lives will have changed for the worse if we do leave on a no deal? Now, I voted to remain, and I would do so again tomorrow. And I do not for 1 minute believe that the EU is a perfect organisation, but of the many things that have been shown about the UK political system and the so-called mother of all parliaments, then it's clear that the UK is broken beyond repair. The EU functions. It is getting on with work for its citizens, and it has at its centre a determination to support all of its members. If the UK wants to take a lesson from the EU, which it probably won't, it's how to look after your members. That's what a union of equals is all about, unlike what we see now in a discredited United Kingdom. Now, I don't want a no deal, as it will be catastrophic for many of my constituents, as well as for many more across Scotland and elsewhere in these islands. The fact that the Prime Minister has been so determined to deliver a no deal highlights how out of touch he really is with reality. However, as we all know, the Prime Minister is in name only. His power has been removed, and even his own brother has given up the ghost. Now, various reports and commentators have highlighted that as to why a no deal will be disastrous. Unite the Union raised their concerns with MSPs in a letter to us all during the summer. And I quote, with the spectre of a no-deal Brexit looming, we have grave concerns over existing legislation which maintains safety and standards on UK roads. We are seeing attacks on drivers' regulations in the United States, and with the much-reported discussions on a UK-US trade deal, we believe that the government may have similar plans. And also the recent report by the UK in a Changing Europe was actually very interesting. It was reported in the Times yesterday. And I quote, that no deal will not get Brexit done. And instead, it would be the start of a period of prolonged uncertainty for citizens, workers and businesses. It also added, a recession is highly probable, but its depth and severity are uncertain. And Anand Menon, a director of the group, who has also given evidence to this Parliament's Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Relations Committee, also highlighted that one of the most challenging effects of no deal would be the long-term consequences, starting with the problem that Britain would still need to negotiate a deal with its largest trading partner, but would do so from a more difficult position. And from a Scottish position, which exports £14.9 billion to the EU, this would be hugely damaging. Furthermore, as the Fraser of Islander Institute, who have also given evidence to the Culture, Tourism, Europe, External Relations Committee, suggested, EU exports are, on their own, nearly as much as Scotland exports to North America, Central and South America, the Middle East, Asia, Africa and Australasia combined. If the Tories don't believe the Fraser of Islander Institute, then they can look at their own UK government's analysis, which is devastating. And I quote, no deal could leave the UK economy 6.3% to 9% smaller after 15 years compared to what it would have been. Also, the worst hit areas economically in a no-deal scenario would be Wales, that's an 8.1% hit, Scotland an 8% reduction, Northern Ireland 9.1% reduction, and the North East of England 10.5% reduction. Now, disruption to cross-channel trade could lead to delays in UK food supply, 30% of which comes from the EU. And also the possible disruption to cross-channel trade would lead to reduced availability and choice of products. And it also warned that some food prices are likely to increase, and there is a risk that consumer behaviour could exacerbate or create shortages in this scenario. Now, the Tories have, and they will continue to do so, just one moment, they will continue to state that they want a deal to be done so that no deal isn't an option. However, the powerless Prime Minister has sent a negotiator to Brussels who isn't negotiating. The Belgian MEP, Philippe Lambert, who is on the EU's Brexit steering group, who has also spoken to this Parliament's Culture Committee, it was pretty clear last night on Channel 4 News when he was asked a question about negotiation. Now, I'm not going to use all of the words, Presiding Officer, but it was, that's BS. That's BS. There's no negotiations simply because the British position is to say we don't want the backstop and we don't want the backstop. Has there been a counter-proposal? There has been nothing. So basically, they are saying, come back with something that pleases us. That is not a negotiation. And I'll take your intervention.
No, you won't, Mr McMillan, because you've only got 30 seconds left.
Right, Presiding Officer, to conclude, from the people realise that Westminster doesn't work, and from the gaming and the downright lies that have been told to remove the UK from the EU, that's alerted many more people to the disintegration of the political elite who are hell-bent on making people poorer. And I think the oft-used phrase is very apt in today's situation. That is, perfidious Albion. Thank you very much.
Neil Finlay, followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. This and the UK Parliament are supposed to be representative parliamentary democracies where power is loaned to MSPs and MPs by the people to exercise for a term of that Parliament, be it 4, 5 or any other number of years. Throughout the Brexit referendum and since, we've heard much comment and spurious rhetoric from Johnson, Gove and the rest about taking back control. Excuse me, about the need to restore UK sovereignty, about the desire to make our own democratic decisions, about the rights of the people and the primacy of the House of Commons. Great pronouncements were made championing parliamentary democracy and the will of the people. But what we've seen this week was an attempt to trash all of that, to undermine parliamentary sovereignty, an attempt to circumvent the very representative democracy that they claimed Brexit was going to restore. Presiding Officer, I regularly read in the media that class is no longer an issue in our politics. We hear pundits and commentators tell us that it's an outdated concept. Well, I have to say this. If anyone watching the antics of Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg and the rest of the Bullingdon boys this week thinks class is irrelevant in our politics, well, they need to lay off the cook and sherry. Because what we saw was an attempted establishment coup. What we saw was an arrogant abuse of power on a scale not seen in modern British political history. This was not some jolly public school dormitory japes. This was the antics of a bunch of privileged, arrogant, elitist, sinister, entitled, proven liars, corrupting our parliamentary democracy, trying to close down the doors of our parliament and, like a thief in the night, steal the rights of every citizen in the land. Their contempt was epitomised by the sight the other night of Jacob Rees-Mogg lounging on the Commons benches as though he owned the place. All he needed was his nanny to come along with his teddy and cocoa and tuck him in for the night. Who do these people think they are? What right do they have to try and take away all our rights and the rights of all the people we represent and they represent? That power is not theirs to give away simply because the government of the day cannot secure a majority for their bigoted, dangerous and irresponsible no-deal agenda, because it won't be Rees-Mogg who will lose his business because of Brexit uncertainty. He's already relocated it to Dublin. Johnson isn't a Honda worker in Swindon losing their jobs because of this shambles. Gove isn't a small food producer with no idea how to export their produce in a few weeks' time if no deal goes through. Yes?
Willie Rennie. Does this mean that Neil Findlay is now wanting to stop Brexit altogether? Neil Findlay.
Mr Rennie, you need to keep up. You really need to keep up. And I would tell you to pay a bit more attention to what's going on. Their inherited wealth, their shareholdings, their investments, their highly paid newspaper columns and speeches will see them through quite nicely, untouched by the crisis that will impact catastrophically on working people if no deal prevails. Presiding Officer, I never thought I would ever in my lifetime see a time when a Prime Minister elected by a tiny number of Tory party members, a Prime Minister with no popular democratic mandate, a Prime Minister with zero legitimacy or credibility, would use threats, patronage, expulsion, lies, arrogance and deception to close down our Parliament. A move supported by every single subservient, brown-nosing Tory MP. And they must be held to account for their actions, and they will. Presiding Officer, can you imagine the reaction of the establishment if a Labour Prime Minister couldn't get legislation through, so decided to close down Parliament? We would see the media, the judiciary, we would see the security services, we would see all arms of the state deployed to bring that government down. And what about the hypocrisy of Tories who raise concerns about democracy in China and Russia and the Middle East and Latin America, then go on to vote to close down our democratically elected Parliament? What a bunch of charlatans they are. Presiding Officer, we must prevent a no deal for the sake of jobs, our economy, for the health and education of our people, for our children's future. For so many reasons, we must prevent the disaster of no deal. And I have to say this finally, Presiding Officer. Ultimately this week, the UK Parliament was threatened by, UK economy was threatened by the action of the Prime Minister and his government. However, on Tuesday, Parliament did its job in defeating the government's march to no deal. MPs of all parties stood up for the rights of their constituents over the executive, and that is a good thing. Presiding Officer, in terms of the House of Commons, 21 Tories stood up against this march to no deal. Yet in this Parliament, every one of those MSPs, Tory MSPs, who have cheered on Theresa May's no deal, now cheer on Boris Johnson's attempt to get a no deal. There is not one of them with any credibility or any backbone.
Thank you. I call, excuse me, I call Jenny Gilruth, followed by Jamie Green. Ms Gilruth, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We must sit up straight in this place. A chair for each member, a desk and a lectern. This is not a place for lounging. Because this is a parliament in which its members come to work, to represent the people who elect us. Presiding Officer, I'm sure we've all watched more Westminster parliamentary television than we care to remember over the past while. All that has done for me is to reaffirm the political beliefs that I've held all my life. The pomp, the arrogance, the sheer entitlement. It's fair to say that my opinion of our esteemed mother of all parliaments has slumped faster than Jacob Rees-Mogg down those green leather benches. But above all that, what angers me most is the game playing. The joy they take in plotting chess moves where they will always win and where my constituents will be the losers. Because in my constituency, it's not a game, it's life. It's my constituents' right to stay here. It's their jobs. It's the cost of what it takes to feed their family. It's the days lost in this debate that could have been spent tackling poverty in their community. It's the fear that they are no longer welcome to call this country home. In Mid-Fife and Glenrothes, we like to make things, and we make things which travel all over the world, from Tanqueray gin at the Cameron Bridge Distillery to the aluminium pigment used in your car paint from Silverline in Leven. And thanks to the Scottish Government, we're now welcoming the return of Leven's Railway after half a century, investment which is going to be transformational for the communities I serve. Contrast that with the behaviour of the UK Government, which is hell-bent on making business for the communities I serve harder. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has confirmed that food prices are to rise in the event of a no-deal Brexit. He told Andrew Marr, "I think that there are a number of economic factors in play. Some prices may go up, others will come down. Maybe's aye, maybe's no." Not good enough, Presiding Officer. Not good enough for the 1 in 3 children in my constituency who are growing up in poverty. Not good enough for the mum in Glenrothes who can barely afford to feed herself, never mind her 4 hungry children. Not good enough for the pensioner in Kenneway who is forced to live in just one room of his house because he cannot afford the heating bills. No, Presiding Officer, no deal is not good enough for my constituents who live with long-term health conditions like diabetes and COPD. The leaked documents from the UK Government's Operation Yellowhammer tell us that medical supplies will be vulnerable to severe extended delays as 3/4 of the UK's medicines enter the country via the main channel crossings. Glenrothes already has the highest percentages for hospitalisation for COPD in Fife. Not good enough. Today's Conservative amendment asks the Chamber to support the UK Government in reaching a deal with the EU, but that premise, of course, accepts that the UK Government actually wants a deal. So perhaps the Scottish Tories might listen to one of their own. On this absurd argument that Boris is trying to get a deal, he's obviously not trying to get a deal. He's dug himself in. He assumes he's going to get no deal because he can't get the right wing of the Conservative Party, many of them now stuck in his cabinet, to agree to it. Not my words, but those of Ken Clarke, who was expelled from the Conservative Party this week, making him the first independent MP to hold the position of the Father of the House since 1815. From the rate clause debates to the gender representation on public boards, Ruth Tories have already proven themselves entirely incapable of doing the right thing in this place. Now, even Ruth knows the game's a bogey. In July, she said, "I don't think the government should pursue a no-deal Brexit, and if it comes to it, I won't support it." And yet, not a single one of her MSPs can admit it. Not a single one will vote to rule out no deal at 5 o'clock tonight because ultimately they believe this Parliament should be subservient. Scotland is being sidelined. Yes, I will.
Liam Kerr.
I'd just like to know, if faced with the options of no deal and the withdrawal deal, would the member urge MPs to back that deal?
Jenny Gilruth.
Thank Liam Kerr for that intervention. I don't know what deal he's talking about. There is no deal. He's living in a fantasy land. Boris has not secured a deal. It doesn't exist. Boris Johnson is exactly who you would rather have in charge of this. Boris, whose comments led to the imprisonment of Zadine Nagrahi Ratcliffe. Boris, who compared women wearing burqas and niqabs to letterboxes. Boris, who yesterday referred to the leader of the opposition as a big girl's blouse. But then again, why should we expect any more from a group of individuals who will soon be led by Murdo Fraser? Presiding Officer, talking of the ridiculous, I would like to return to Jacob Rees-Mogg. In 1997, he stood in the Central Fife constituency against one Henry McLeish and my predecessor, Tricia from Arwick. It is a well-known story that has already been mentioned by Neil Finlay today that Rees-Mogg took his nanny out on the campaign trail. He confirmed as much, stating, "I was going to take my Bentley, but she," that's the nanny by the way, "wisely said that this would be seen as ostentatious and that I should take Mummy's Mercedes instead." Suffice to say, Mummy's Mercedes did not go down well in Leven, where he referred to those claiming benefits as the scourge of the earth. Let us return to what a no-deal Brexit will mean for our constituents. Fewer jobs, food shortages, depleted medical supplies, and all of this is confirmed by the UK Government's own analysis. What is left of the United Kingdom is a place now being governed by a party who have deselected Winston Churchill's grandson. Or, as the father of the house put it, "I don't recognise my party. It's been taken over by a bizarre character and the most right-wing cabinet. The Prime Minister comes to us and talks total rubbish." The Tories' amendment is worse than total rubbish. It is lacking any suggestion of political backbone. The time for these Tories to prove their worth has long since passed, but we all know they're Boris's backers now. I just hope that unwavering loyalty pays them the dividend they deserve at the ballot box. Thank you.
I call Jamie Green to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Mr Green, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, Mr Russell and I may not agree on many things politically, no least Scotland's position in the UK, or indeed, as we now know, UK's position in Europe. But at times over the past few years, I've participated in many debates like this, some of the 34 that was mentioned, and I've listened to the discourse between these benches and those of Mr Russell's, and I've respected his academic approach to the arguments that he makes, whilst disrespecting the motion that he's penned. But today's motion is different, and I'm quite surprised by it. And I'm surprised because no least after 2 months of this Parliament in recess, the government chooses, of the precious 9 hours that we sit for a week, to donate such a chunk of it to Mr Russell, to repeat the same well-rehearsed mantras about Brexit and his opposition to the Conservatives in Westminster. 34 debates, every one another chapter for his book. Because what I've heard nothing of from the middle benches is any suggestion about what MSPs in this place are expected to do about how we exit the EU, or what MSPs in this place are supposed to do to alter the dates or duration of the prorogation of Westminster. It is the full outrage of the SNP over Brexit that is as confusing as it is predictable, because the reality is that today's motion is asking us to condemn a no-deal Brexit. But the reality is that there is no type of Brexit that the SNP will support. I would argue that they have been nothing but obstructive and obtrusive throughout this entire process. Now, they can protest otherwise, but they will be judged by their track record in Westminster. They voted against even triggering Article 50 in the first place. They refused to accept the democratic result of this UK-wide referendum. But then again, they never were very good at accepting the results of referendum. They voted for extensions to Article 50, trying to delay Brexit happening. They voted against a sensible withdrawal deal, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And every single time, they made no deal more and more likely. They voted against a deal. They voted against the deal that was designed to secure EU citizens' rights, that would agree our financial exit from Europe, and, more importantly, enter into that transition that business so much was crying out for. They voted for Parliament to take control of the Commons business, undermining the government's ability to negotiate, and they voted for the no-deal bill, handing all the negotiating power back to Brussels on a plight. The reality is, Presiding Officer, there is simply no version of Brexit, deal or no deal, that the SNP will ever support, and we know that. Why are they even pretending? Why are they pretending that it is this form of Brexit or that type of Brexit which offends them so? Graham Simpson is absolutely right. Over 1 million Scots voted to leave the EU, and they must have a voice in this place and in this debate. And who are those million? Who are those million? They were Conservative voters. They were Labour voters. Some of them were SNP voters. Some of them were voters of no political persuasion at all. But who, time after time, have to sit and listen to debates like this and endure a narrative that says to them that their votes do not matter and their votes do not count. Well, Presiding Officer, those votes do matter and they do count to these benches. This was a UK-wide referendum. Now, I know that the SNP don't want the UK to exist per se, but I'm sorry, it exists. It's what Scotland voted for, and it's about time they accepted that. I've always said that we should leave the EU with a deal. But presented with that challenge, Westminster denied it happening. The real question is now, if presented with a deal, be that the previously agreed withdrawal agreement, which was agreed with the EU27 and the UK, or another deal, will the SNPs get behind it and vote for it, or are they so ideologically opposed to Brexit that they will oppose any form of deal? Today's motion doesn't even seek to or try to answer that question. And it is worth making the point that if the EU's position is that they wouldn't even negotiate with the UK on its future relationship until after the UK had left the Union, what makes Nicola Sturgeon so sure that Scotland's experience with Europe would be any different? Can you imagine a scenario, SNP party conference, if I have time, briefly?
Willie Rennie.
Can he guarantee, he was talking about whether the SNP MPs, and I presume others, would support any deal that was forthcoming. Can he guarantee that his own MPs would back that deal? All of them?
Jamie Green.
I'm going to echo the words of Ruth Davidson last week's speech she gave to the media, where she urged all MPs who have a duty in Westminster to support a deal, because I don't want no deal. I don't think the country wants no deal, and I hope that they don't either. The reality is they have to vote for one for it to happen. So I hope they do. The reality is, Presiding Officer, in my closing remarks, these benches are the only benches in this chamber that will respect the outcome of the referendum. These benches are the only benches who want Scotland to come out of the hated common fisheries policies. These benches are the only benches that do not want to hand those powers straight back to Brussels, as these do. These benches want a deal, and these benches will support the government in getting one. So let me say, Mr Russell, actions speak louder than words. If you want no deal, then stop grandstanding and instruct your MPs to vote for one.
Thank you. I call Stuart Stevenson, who will be followed by Pauline McNeill. Mr Stevenson, please.
The Independent newspaper today reports that, quote, some loud bloke who stunk of booze yelling at us, end quote, as being how Number 10 attempted to persuade the 21 former Tory MPs to vote for Prime Minister in name only, Johnson's plans. The New York Times today described it as a sobering week for the Prime Minister, if only. The Cabinet Secretary and others have confirmed that the EU have seen nothing by way of proposals from the UK Government. Now, our colleague Donald Cameron is a serious man with a demonstrated ability to think through complicated issues and break them down into solvable bite-sized chunks. The attributes of the Scottish advocate down the ages. But today's amendment in his name falls very substantially short of what his pupil master would have required of him in his days to train as an advocate. Proper parliamentary procedures continue here, while they've been abandoned by a Prime Minister who's yet to win any vote at all in the House of which he should remember he is a servant. Here our duty is to offer sober-minded dissection of even the most obtuse proposals. So let me take the three parts of Mr Cameron's amendment. First, respecting referendums. Well, there's always been a fundamental conflict between the 2014 and 2016 referendums. One of the key reasons the argument for Scottish independence was lost in 2014 was the attachment, later proved by the 2016 vote, that the people of Scotland had to their membership of the EU. The No campaign asserted that Scotland could only remain in the EU if they rejected independence. And my side of the argument then lacked the ammunition to convincingly rebut that now provably implausible argument. Now, in passing, I note that many of my constituents see opportunity, even a sea of opportunity, in leaving the common fisheries policy, a policy that only the SNP have always opposed. But many also now see, you better keep listening, but many now also see the ruin that awaits our fish processors from Theresa May's choice of the method of exit. And at 8:58 this morning, I received an email from the largest fish processing firm that there is, on the record, and I'm going to quote from it, exactly what it says. The Scottish Conservatives today in the Edinburgh Parliament will beat their normal drum of stating that the Conservatives are champions of the Scottish fishing industry. From my end, I'm very clear. Leaving the EU without a deal will cause long-term damage to the fishing industry, both the catching and onshore sectors, and will result in a considerable economic loss to our coastal communities. A no-deal exit has to be avoided at all costs. I wish you well in the debate. I'm confident that the point that all sectors of the Scottish economy will be adversely affected and damaged through the actions of a Conservative group of UK ministers driven by a right-wing ideologue. It has to be stopped. That's the fishing industry that was the one area of Scotland that might have been expected under a proper exit to have benefited, but clearly sees that what the Tories are progressing now is not going to do it. So, that conflict between the two referendums defeats the first plank of the Tory amendment. The second plank is negotiated exit. And we know that there is no negotiation, and therefore there is no negotiated exit in prospect. Because he's not negotiating is Mr Johnson, no proposals tabled, and my long history of business negotiations has persuaded me that going into negotiation with a blank sheet of paper and waving it under the other side of the table's nose progresses that negotiation not at all. Clearly, Johnson has spent too much time with Trump and is adopting his relationship to truth, rationality and clarity. Now, thirdly, I don't know how one reaches a deal when one refuses to allow civil servants to meaningfully engage with the EU and politicians are carrying blank sheets of paper to Brussels. As Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. As a lawyer, Donald Cameron will be familiar with the saying, a man who is his own lawyer has a fool for a client. Well, it's perhaps time to update that old saying. A man who journeys without a map will never know his destination. The Tories, clueless, leaderless, mapless. The Tories, beyond reason, beyond parody, beyond hope. Presiding Officer.
I call Pauline McNeill, who will be followed by Fulton McGregor. Miss McNeill.
Sadly, the country has never been so divided, and it feels irreversibly so. It is hard to see how we can undo the damage to British politics as the Tory party continue to preside over it and probably destroy their own party in the process. Britain has lost touch with what it is in the world, according to Tory peer William Waldegrave, a man I never thought I'd quote. But he points that whatever happens about Brexit Britain, it's going to change forever. After Brexit, he says, we will be a diminished country. We will have less influence in the world with our partners and other members of the EU. We're not even out of the European Union, and yet we already do not recognise the country that we live in as people stockpile medicines and foods now already. The party of Thatcher Major and Ted Heath now is only fixated on the issue of Brexit, a Conservative party, as others have said, without Kenneth Clarke, Rory Stewart, Nicholas Soames and all the moderates that we've come to know and disagree with, perhaps, but they are moderates, threatened by their own leader, purged by their own party for opposing the Johnson-Cummings plan for standing up for what they believe in. The deep cynical behaviour of the current cabinet is best summed up by Nicholas Soames, thanking members of the cabinet by saying that their serial disloyalty has been such an inspiration to so many of us who've never seen such hypocrisy in your life. I found it quite amusing last week when Steve Richards, the journalist, first described Philip Hammond as Britain's own Che Guevara. But in all seriousness, I do actually think that history will judge people like Philip Hammond to be someone who did the right thing when the time came because he stood up for what he believed in. I would say to Jamie Green and others that that is what tonight is about. Tonight is about whether or not the parties in this Parliament simply can find a consensus that whatever we think about Brexit, that a no deal is damaging and is not desirable. It would be sad, actually, if today the Scottish Tories cannot find it in themselves to stand with the rest of us and send a clear message that no deal is acceptable. It is the one thing I thought we could agree on. Even the most popular Tory leader of all time, Ruth Davidson, it's quite clear where she stands on that. I say that the benches opposite, you've lost your way if you do not come to that conclusion at 5 p.m. tonight. If you can't stand up and be counted in this place, when we know, as other members have recounted, the real and present danger of a no deal, not only does it risk betraying the poorest of people, but I'd actually go as far as to say you betray the values in your own party if you not be clear about a no deal tonight. I will take an intervention from Jamie Green.
Jamie Green.
I'm just intrigued to find out what the member thinks the effect of not delivering on the Brexit result will have on not just our party, but her own.
Had 3 years. The Tory party have had 3 years to deliver on Brexit. We have not seen a credible deal. But Jamie Green, I think you actually do know. I think you're pretending you don't know the purpose of tonight. If you really say, as you said, that you oppose a no deal, well, I challenge you, why don't you vote for it tonight? Because Donald Cameron said that Scottish businesses want a deal, and that is not really true. What most Scottish businesses have said is that they would take a deal, and there's a difference between wanting and taking a deal. I've only got 6 minutes. I'm sorry, I can't take a further intervention. An orderly departure after 3 years, that was your responsibility, and you've absolutely failed. Because I began this journey, and if you look back at the speeches I've made in this place, of supporting a form of Brexit that would best protect the people and the lives of our economy. But it's never really been on the table. A withdrawal agreement, I don't need to point out, is not a deal. But I've come to realise that leaving Europe, regardless of the consequences, is the primary objective of the Leave camp. And they have concealed the true damaging consequences of that from people. I think it's interesting that even the question of Northern Ireland and the peace that was achieved by your own party's contribution has not been mentioned. I and others know that there's going to be decades of austerity through a no deal, which is why I feel so strongly about it. People are entitled to know the truth. The leaked UK government report, Yellowhammer, revealed the probable consequences of leaving without a deal. People have the right to know this. I don't see why it was a secret document. We know that there will be transport disruption across the Channel. There will be immigration checks. We don't even know the half of what might come about. World trade terms. It leaves Britain exposed to high tariffs that we cannot control. I don't see why you would trust Donald Trump to give Britain a decent set of trade terms when he's already at war with China and Canada over steel imports. This is not a man that can be trusted to strike a trade deal. I will not take lessons on democracy from the party opposite that this week have thwarted the mother of parliaments, threatening their own MPs for standing for what they believe in. They either believe the parliament is sovereign or they don't. Presiding officer, on this occasion and on this motion, I will be proud to stand with every single member in this Parliament on the single message that a no-deal Brexit is not acceptable to Scotland, it's not acceptable to the Scottish people, it's not in the interest. And if you're a politician that has come here to try and stand up for working people, then you have a duty to support and vote for this motion tonight. We can argue thereafter on the things we disagree about, but tonight you have to vote against no deal.
Thank you. I don't like being pernickety, but it is my job to be pernickety, is that the term you should not be used directly towards each other. I understand people get excited, they do it, but try to desist. Can I then call, please, Fulton McGregor, followed by Liam Kerr?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2016, the idea of the UK leaving the EU without a deal seemed impossible. Over the last 3 years, I, like everybody else, have watched with horror as this has become a possibility, then a likelihood, and now, with only a matter of weeks remaining, a very real and present danger to our country. And as others have said before me today already, a no-deal Brexit is unthinkable with catastrophic economic and social effects. And the thing is, this is widely accepted, whether you voted like me to remain or you voted to leave. Because any Leave voters that I've spoken to didn't cast their vote to damage the economy or leave themselves or their friends, family and neighbours unemployed. The situation has also again laid bare the very unequal state of this so-called union of equals and the huge democratic deficit we have. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain, and we have reiterated that at every election since the vote. But we are being ignored. We are being told we voted as a UK and that we must accept the decisions made for us. People who continually use this argument, to my mind, simply do not understand the principles of self-determination, devolution and equality in decision-making. Scotland deserves better. The people and businesses in my constituency of Coatbridge and Chryson deserve better. EU nationals that call Scotland their home deserve better. Over the last year, like many colleagues, I've been engaging directly with EU nationals in my constituency, and the message is clear from them. They want to stay and continue to provide in the amazing ways that they do, and they want to do what is best for this country. Hundreds turned up to an EU surgery I held on the 7th of December, where it was clear that what was going on was an attack on their basic human rights. My constituents were concerned about homes that they had bought, what rights their children who were born here had, where they stood with permanent jobs that they were committed to, and the pensions that they had contributed to, what access they would have to healthcare, and much more. And they're right to be concerned. It was only this week that the Home Secretary had to backtrack on the vow to end the freedom of movement for EU nationals on October the 31st. This was not because she had a change of heart. It was because lawyers and policy experts deemed it impossible to implement. This is not what Scotland wants, Presiding Officer. We are an open and inclusive, welcoming country. And of course, I believe independence is the best way for us to achieve our potential. But at a minimum, power around immigration should be devolved in order to allow us to treat people with humanity and to grow our economy. It's been said time and time again in this chamber, but I must repeat that a no deal for Scotland will be absolutely disastrous. There is no sector of the Scottish economy that will be unscathed by Brexit. In February, a Scottish Government report showed us that a no-deal Brexit could see our GDP drop by 7%. And if anyone needs a reminder of how bad a no-deal would be, here's a recap of what was found in the Operation Yellowhammer Cabinet contingency papers. Lower food stocks hitting our most vulnerable groups, medical supply shortages, petrol import tariffs leading to job losses and impacting fuel supplies, shortages in social care and a return of a hard border in Ireland. Do this Tory government know no bounds? At a time when people are struggling under austerity and welfare cuts. Only a couple of weeks ago, I put out an appeal for Coatbridge Food Bank, who are struggling for supplies. Of course, the people of Coatbridge and Chryson responded with the usual generosity and kindness, but it's a pretty grim state of affairs in the first place. And what did our elitist government think is a good idea? Oh yeah, a Brexit cliff edge. This UK government is not one that is standing up for the ordinary family in Scotland or even across the UK as a whole. And if they're not the people, for people, surely they're the people for businesses. Not again in my area. The number of businesses in Coatbridge and Chryson that have came to me and saying that they're worried about Brexit, the impact on workforce, mainly local workforce, is staggering. In 2014, the Tories told Scotland that we'd be better together and we'd be stronger as a union. And I hope the irony of those sentiments is not lost in the chamber this afternoon. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, I don't think that it is. Never have Holyrood and Westminster been in such different paths. While Westminster's in chaos, this week the Scottish Government launched another progressive and exciting programme for government, with climate change, fairness and social justice at its heart. Presiding Officer, it's clear that we're on very different paths. I wanted to quickly raise, during this debate, my office have been in touch, and this is a real-life example to say that they've been speaking to somebody today who has just had their settled status denied by the UK Government. The individual has been asked for further evidence, a letter from their employer, a letter from their university, a letter from their school where they attended several years ago. This lady has been here for 8 years already, and she's been asked for this information. This is an attack on human rights. It's absolutely staggering. That's a real-life example. Text to me this afternoon while we've been having this debate. Presiding Officer, there's little doubt now we're moving towards a general election. The sooner the better, I say. but it's clear that Scotland must be given a choice over our own future. It's time, Presiding Officer, for Scotland's future to be firmly in Scotland's hands.
Thank you. I call Liam Kerr, who will be followed by Ruth Maguire, and Ms Maguire is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It will come as no surprise to the Chamber that I shall not be voting for the SNP motion today, and I do commend the Conservative amendment. Presiding Officer, we need to be clear where we started here. In a UK-wide referendum on the 23rd of June 2016, 17.4 million people cast their vote for leave, whilst 16.1 million voted remain. It was a straight question, which, despite what has just been asserted, was not caveated by considerations of a second referendum, the form of any deal, or indeed whether any deal would be struck. Now, I was one of those who voted remain, but the voters of the UK disagreed with me in what is arguably the largest democratic exercise ever seen in this country. And I am a Democrat, which means I do not think it appropriate to say to people that because they voted differently from me, they must have been mistaken or misguided and should have another go. Yeah.
Claire Adamson.
Democratic event in the UK. What a pity does he not agree that European Union citizens didn't get a choice in that exercise as they would have done in the Scottish Parliament or Council votes and other referendums from this place?
Liam Kerr.
I think the point is that the form of the referendum and the franchise on it and the electorate on it was agreed. Everything about it was agreed beforehand, and this gives the lie to the proposition that the people didn't know what they were voting for and in which referendum. Look, Parliament voted to hold that referendum and the people delivered a result, and it is incumbent upon our elected representatives to respect that vote and act on it, as they said they would when the referendum was called. Within that context, however, I do agree with Donald Cameron that the rational and sensible thing to do is strike a deal with the EU to ensure that our leaving is as frictionless as possible. It makes sense to me that when a relationship such as that between the UK and the EU fundamentally changes, both parties agree on how that relationship will look going forward. And that is why the UK government has been clear that it has never pursued a no-deal Brexit. It is clear that the UK government has always seen a negotiated exit from the EU as the best outcome, and that is evidenced in that MPs have had 3 opportunities to vote on a deal. The Prime Minister has said repeatedly that we do want to do a deal, and we have seen movement in Brussels. Have I time, Presiding Officer?
Won't make it up. You won't make it up.
I'm sorry, Mr Finlay, I better not. That shows why the SNP motion should be rejected today, because what that motion demonstrates, beyond all doubt, is the paucity of commercial experience within the SNP ranks, and/or that those in the SNP who do have some commercial experience have spent too long out of the world of negotiation. To those with any commercial nous, it is almost trite that one cannot present a single proposition without a fallback, a walk-away position. You do not negotiate by saying, this is what we want, and if you don't like it, well, that's okay. What would you give us instead? That is an extraordinary position for this Parliament to be asked to take. Presiding Officer, if we truly want to act in the national interest, we must surely support the Prime Minister and the UK Government in its efforts to renegotiate the deal and leave on October 31st. But we must do that in circumstances where the EU... Mike Rumbles.
Mike Rumbles.
I thank Liam Kerr for taking an intervention. I find it curious that he has such trust in Boris Johnson's word as our Prime Minister, when his own brother, who was a ministerial colleague this morning, doesn't have that same faith in his brother because he understands there is no deal in the offing.
Liam Kerr.
On the contrary, we heard from Donald Cameron just earlier, Mr Rumbles, just how much is going on to secure that deal. And look, at the end of the day, the SNP are not serious. Just this week, Nicola Sturgeon claimed SNP MPs will do everything possible to stop the UK crashing out of the EU without a deal. Everything possible, Presiding Officer. Now, if that were true, then the question begged is simple. Why didn't they? Because the withdrawal agreement was brought forward 3 times. 3 times, Presiding Officer. And the people of Scotland will not forget that not 1, not one of the SNP MPs voted for the very thing that would have taken no deal off the table. Indeed, they voted against it, despite the fact that it met their own demands. Everything possible indeed. Presiding Officer, whether it conformed to our personal vote or not, the people of the United Kingdom voted that the UK should leave the EU, and Parliament voted to trigger Article 50 to effect that exit. Fulton McGregor opines that a no-deal Brexit would be disastrous, and maybe he's right. And that's why I welcome the Prime Minister's attempts to reach a deal with the EU and believe that the Scottish Parliament should support and not undermine this. And that is the crucial difference between the Scottish Conservatives and the SNP. We respect referendums in which people have their say, even where we might not agree with the result. And what I and many unionists across Scotland are incandescent about, including Willie Rennie, I'm happy to see here earlier on, is the SNP trying to use my vote to remain in the EU as a proxy vote to drag Scotland out of the United Kingdom. Presiding Officer, 1 million people in Scotland who voted leave expect their democratic vote to be respected. And all of us in this chamber who are genuine believers in democracy expect it too. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Ruth Maguire, then we move to closing speeches. Ms Maguire.
Presiding Officer, I have a confession. As I watched Jacob Rees-Mogg, Leader of the House, and that wonderful mother of all parliaments, recline languidly on the front bench during the debate on Tuesday night. Initially, I felt a wee bit sorry for him. It was late, they'd had a long day, it must be tiring in that uncomfortable chamber with its ridiculous customs and archaic way of doing business. But that flash of empathy soon left me. Entitlement, arrogance, disdain for colleagues. The reason he could so comfortably lounge around during an important debate, and I believe it's a point that stands for most, if not all, of the current Westminster government, it is that it doesn't matter to them what happens. They'll be cushioned, they'll be protected. None of this will impact on their families or their friends. Their privilege means they can treat this like a game. But it's not a game. Exiting the EU with no deal would be an economic catastrophe for Scotland and undoubtedly will cause real harm to the most vulnerable in the communities that we're here to represent. The Tories' own analysis shows just how devastating a no-deal scenario would be, and yet they don't think we should rule it out. 30% of our food comes from the EU, and disruption to cross-channel trade, and I quote, would lead to reduced availability and choice of products. It warned that food prices are likely to increase, and there's a risk that consumer behaviour could exacerbate or create shortages. I think some of us are seeing examples of that changing consumer behaviour already. People are telling me that they're stockpiling food. But more importantly than that, much more importantly than that, are the many people in my constituency who simply won't have the resources to do this. Presiding Officer, food shortages in 2019 in a country as wealthy as ours is absolutely shameful. We've got a responsibility as parliamentarians to provide reassurance where we can. On this I can't, and I'll freely admit how concerned I am. With most things, this will hit the most vulnerable the hardest, and the wealthy and the privileged will be cushioned. This is the only time in my adult life that the more I've learned about something, the worse I've felt about it, and the less able I've been to provide that reassurance. In an open letter to all UK party leaders, demanding action to stop a no-deal exit from the European Union, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations reiterates who will feel the pain and highlights the hugely negative impact no-deal Brexit could have on staffing, and says that it could, and I quote, wreck communities, lives and organisations that so many people rely on. The work of the voluntary and third sector in Scotland is vital to our communities. There are over 40,000 voluntary sector organisations. Every member in here will know of such organisations in their own constituencies and regions that are central to the quality of our constituency's life. They're already operating under some of the most challenging situations, delivering vital work in a time of huge budget constraint. When they describe leaving the EU without a deal as a reckless act, when they state that it's clear that increased demand for assistance, coupled with a loss of funding and staff, will undoubtedly see charities collapse and leave a vacuum of support that cannot be filled, we should listen and we should act. We also know that many of the voluntary and third sector organisations are involved in providing health and social care alongside the NHS and local authority provision. A no-deal Brexit will have damaging and lasting consequences for our health and social care systems, again impacting on some of those who need the most support. Presiding Officer, 6% of the current health and social care workforce are non-UK nationals. Their contribution is greatly valued, and I am heartsick that they feel unwelcome in this country. UK immigration policy after leaving the EU could create a barrier to any entry-level routes into health and care professions. Salaries in social care in particular would not meet the Tory government's proposed minimum threshold, with average salaries closer to £18,000. And does that not just say everything about the Tories, making an assessment on the amount of money someone will have, rather than the skills that they bring or the need that our community has for those skills? The UK government's immigration plans could reduce the number of workers in Scotland by up to 5%. We need to increase our workforce here, not reduce it. Despite attempts to spin otherwise, Boris Johnson's attempts to shut down Parliament, to force through a no-deal exit from the EU, are an outrageous assault on democratic principles. There is no democracy, security or prosperity for Scotland in Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain. The people of Scotland deserve so much better. I hope MSPs in here will act accordingly this evening.
Thank you very much. Closing speeches. I call on James Kelly to close for Labour. 6 minutes. Mr. Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's right that Parliament has the opportunity to speak out tonight on the issue of a no-deal Brexit, because let's be absolutely clear, a no-deal would be an absolute disaster. As Mike Russell points out, it would be even more severe than many of the commentators realise. Because if you look even just at the economic impact of that and what derives from that, it would have a drastic impact on our communities. Think of the collapse of trading arrangements and trading agreements and the jobs that that would cost in economies, not just in Scotland, but up and down the United Kingdom. And the knock-on effect of that would be people would lose their jobs. It would drive up already drastic poverty levels. And as we've heard, there would be a shortage of medicines in the NHS, meaning that people would become more vulnerable and more ill. Also, the impact on UK and Scottish budgets would be more severe, because if you've got less money in the economy, you have less people paying taxes, and therefore budgets would be driven down, and we would see more severe cuts and a drastic impact in public services. So that's the reality of no deal, and it's right that Parliament speaks out to reject that. I was surprised to hear Donald Cameron defend the suspension of Parliament. As Alec Rowley quite rightly said, really what it is an attempt to shut down democracy and close down debate. Because Boris Johnson and his cohorts realise that they don't have the votes, they don't have the support in Parliament for a no deal, and have basically tried to shut down the operation as much as possible in order to get to the 31st of October. And it's right that Parliament has spoken out and reacted against that this week. And I think, again, Liam Kerr gives us the impression that Boris Johnson wants a deal, and the Tories want a deal. But the evidence points to the fact that Boris Johnson does not want a deal. He was elected as Prime Minister on the 24th of July. We're now at the 6th of September. That's over 7 weeks down the line. As we've heard in this debate and we've heard today, he's still to put any proposal to the EU. So we can't take these claims seriously that Boris Johnson or some in the Tory party want a deal. This is a strategy devised by Dominic Cummings to crash out with a no-deal Brexit, and also to try and drive towards an election, as Willie Rennie pointed out, to buy off the Brexit party and to try and return these right-wing Tories into power. But as Ross Greer pointed out, the reality is that the Tories this week are in absolute chaos. I mean, Boris Johnson, only 3 days has he actually appeared in Parliament and he's lost 3 votes. His credibility has been severely undermined. And the way that he's treated some in his party, effectively sacking 21 MPs for having a different view on such an important issue has been disgraceful. I think Neil Findlay is right to point out the hypocrisy of the Scottish Tories. They must be ashamed. I sit on the Finance and Constitution Committee with Murdo Fraser, and earlier in the year we've looked at these Brexit issues, and all the Tories on the committee, Murdo Fraser and Adam Tonkins included, signed up to make it clear that no deal would not be a desirable outcome. But here, that is what the Tories are crashing towards, and the reality is that the group over there have sat on their hands. Pauline McNeill is right to challenge them. If you really care about these issues, then you should press your button to oppose no deal at 5 o'clock. It's quite clear that, and it's welcome, that the no deal legislation is progressing through Parliament. The House of Commons has taken the correct steps there, and there's absolutely no doubt that a general election is coming. And when that general election comes, I firmly believe that Boris Johnson will be exposed as a right-wing Etonian who's out of touch with communities up and down Scotland and the United Kingdom. If Boris Johnson comes to Cambuslang, where I grew up, where I stay and I represent, he will not be able to understand the struggles that local people face. He won't understand people who have to do 3 jobs in order to make ends meet. He won't understand people who can't afford the bus fare and have to walk to the job centre in the rain. He won't understand families who have to send their kids out to school in the morning without a proper Brexit. And when that election comes, Boris Johnson and the Tories will get exposed up and down the country for the right-wing traitors that they are, out of touch with people. Bring on the election and kick the Tories out.
I call Murdo Fraser to close for the Conservatives. 6 minutes, please, Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Earlier in this debate, Graham Simpson reminded us that we have had 34 debates on Brexit in this chamber already. And it might have been hoped in the course of 2 hours this afternoon we would have heard some new arguments. And while we have had quite a lot of heat in this debate, there has been very little light. And as Jamie Green said a few moments ago, there have been no new arguments put forward in this debate that we have not heard many times in the past. I didn't agree with all the points he made, but at least Graham Simpson, in his contribution, spoke up for the 1 million Scots who voted leave. 38% of those who voted in the referendum voted leave, a group which is all too often airbrushed out of Scottish history, but do indeed need to have a voice and be represented. There are, Deputy Presiding Officer, 2 essential points I think to take from this debate. The first is that we need to respect the referendum result. It is the duty of the government to do as they promised to do in advance of the referendum and deliver on the outcome of that referendum, which was, of course, a UK-wide vote. Yes, if the member's brief, I'll give way.
John Mason.
I just wonder if the member would accept that if it had been a 90% to 10% message in the referendum, that would have supported a harder Brexit, but such a narrow one clearly supports a soft Brexit.
I look forward to, if we ever have another independence referendum, to the member supporting a higher threshold than is currently the case, if that's his argument. The fact is the terms were set, it was a majority, and we should respect the outcome. And we know that the SNP don't like respecting the outcome of referendums, and as Donald Cameron reminded us, they don't even like respecting votes that take place in this Parliament. Now, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, I'm sorry to say, are equally culpable. They don't like the result of the referendum either, and they're both now signed up for a rerun. They want to overturn the result of the referendum, and they have the temerity to lecture us about not supporting democracy. We've heard from the Labour Party the most ridiculous, hysterical hyperbole this afternoon about the Conservative Party undermining democracy. I would simply say to them, if the Labour Party really care about democracy, why are they currently blocking a general election? Let them bring forward a general election and let the people decide, or are they worried that nobody is going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn? The second point, presiding officer, is this. I don't want a no-deal Brexit. James Kelly referred to what happened in the Finance and Constitution Committee. I haven't changed my mind on a no-deal Brexit. I share many of the concerns that have been expressed about the impact of a no-deal Brexit. But we can't just say we're against a no-deal Brexit. We have to act. We have to deliver on the referendum outcome and reach an agreement, reach a deal. And that is the policy of the UK government right now, presiding officer. And Donald Cameron reminded us that I need to make some progress, reminded us that the withdrawal agreement was supported by the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, it was supported by the Scotch Whisky Association, it was supported by Diageo, it was supported by the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, supported by the National Farmers Union of Scotland, and supported by Sir Ian Wood, amongst many other voices. And there were 3 opportunities the House of Commons had to support the withdrawal agreement, and on each of these occasions, every single member of the SNP in the House of Commons rejected them. And yes, I know there were other members of other parties who also rejected them, but on the final count, every single Scottish Tory MP supported the withdrawal agreement, as did the current Prime Minister. But it was voted down on the back of the votes of the other parties in this chamber. So they say they want no deal, but it's just words. They're not actually doing anything to stop it happening. On Tuesday, the First Minister in this chamber said this: SNP MPs will do everything possible to stop the UK crashing out of the EU without a deal. Everything possible, Deputy Presiding Officer. But Michael Russell told me when I intervened with him just a couple of hours ago, he gave the game away. He said even if the withdrawal agreement came back, SNP MPs would still vote it down. That's not everything possible, Presiding Officer. That is them voting down a deal that would prevent a no-deal Brexit that they say they're against. And I would say to Mr Russell, there was a staggering lack of self-awareness from him when he talked about the risk of Brexit making us poorer and cutting us off from our markets. He comes from a party which supports independence, which on the basis of his own government's GERS figures published just a month ago would create a deficit of £12.6 billion in the Scottish public finances, a £2,000 a head of population annual support and a union dividend from the rest of the UK that he would cut off. And the UK market that he would cut us off from is worth 3 times as much to Scottish business as is the EU market that he seems more concerned about. He needs to get his facts right, Deputy Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, Gillian Martin said we should vote with our conscience. Well, that is precisely what we on this side of the chamber will be doing. I don't want a no-deal Brexit. We want a deal. We have to respect the referendum result, but we have to avoid no deal. And it is a rich irony that those who opposed the withdrawal agreement, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and who are still saying today they will oppose a deal, are the ones saying they must do everything to prevent no deal. They say that, but it's just words, because they have no intention of doing anything actual to progress a deal and rule out no deal. Presiding Officer, another political stunt this afternoon will make no difference to the outcome of the Brexit process. What will make a difference are votes in the House of Commons, votes for a deal that delivers on the referendum result. That is what we should be working for, and that is why we should be supporting the amendment in Donald Cameron's name.
Thank you. I call on Michael Russell to close to the Government Cabinet Secretary till decision time, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by welcoming Donald Cameron and Alec Rowley to their new positions? I've worked with both Donald Cameron and Alec Rowley in different circumstances. Alec Rowley for a very long time indeed, before this Parliament was first elected. It is a measure of the tragedy of Brexit that we should have to spend so much time on something which Scotland does not want. We could spend our time much more profitably, but the reason we are here, and I shall come back to that, is because of a flawed policy being pursued by a deeply flawed political party. Let me just touch on some of the contributions before I try and explode 4 myths that we've heard this afternoon. Let me just start by commending something Alec Rowley said, because he was absolutely right to say that people who say we just want Brexit over, we just want it done, don't really understand what they're saying. Because getting Brexit over on the terms that Boris Johnson wishes, which is a no deal, which is what he wishes, there is no doubt about that, wouldn't get Brexit over with. It would start a spiral of decline that would last for years. And there's no doubt about that, because there is no such thing in the end as a no deal. There would have to be a deal at some stage. And that would require a very long period until the United Kingdom government got its head into that space. And the damage to be done to every one of our constituents would be enormous, including the constituents which those members represent, because those members are putting themselves in the position of condemning many of their constituents to poverty if they allow a no deal to take place. I was slightly depressed, I have to say, by the contribution of Willie Rennie, and I put this to him fairly. We had agreed to work together this afternoon, and the first few minutes of Willie Rennie's speech were all about how we should do it. But he could not resist, I'm afraid, having a go at Alec Rowley and having a go at me. But I'll put that to one side, because actually I hope we are all going to vote the same way this evening, and perhaps then the next time the period of consensus could last a little longer. I was, however, heartened by Neil Finlay's intervention on Ross Greer, because he said if the Scottish Government were to do something outrageous. I thought Mr Finlay believed that we did something outrageous every 20 minutes. So if he's still waiting for us to do something outrageous, I am heartened. But I want to come on to this. Let me just make one further point before I do. The Welsh Assembly has just voted, I'm told, this afternoon, overwhelmingly in favour of a motion opposing the prorogation of Parliament and reiterating its view that no deal will cause long-term damage to Wales. I hope we will take the same decision as far as Scotland is concerned this afternoon, isolating the Tories. And of course, the Welsh Assembly also has representatives of the Brexit Party there, which we don't have. Well, we do have, because Mr Simpson is a representative of the Brexit Party in all but name, as we know from his speech this afternoon. But I will come on to that in just a moment. Let me deal with these 4 Tory myths, the first of which says that if you don't want a no deal, you have to vote for their deal. Now, the reality is that we have tried repeatedly to get a compromise. I would bring in evidence all the papers that we published from December 2016, which indicated how a deal could be done. But the people who didn't want that deal were the Conservatives, and specifically it was Theresa May. She did not wish to compromise in any way. So the fact that we are here now without a deal is to do with the Tories. And a no deal will be a choice of the Tories. That is what will take place, and it will be disastrous. And others know that. Donald Cameron knows that because he wrote an article at the end of March 2019, which was published in the Herald. And that article talks about the chaos of a no-deal Brexit. Donald Cameron knows that what the UK government is about to do will produce chaos. And I think that should go on the record too. Let me deal with the second of the myths that exist. And that is the Tories have a plan. They have a purpose. The Prime Minister has something that he is going to take to Brussels and everything will be fine. And it's extraordinary how people believe that. I saw Paul Masterton saying that people, seeing how he voted the other day, would say, "You're an idiot, Paul." I was tempted. But in reality, the people are being conned by the Prime Minister. The people who know there is no deal are the people involved in negotiations. And for example, Tony Connolly, RTE's Europe editor, one of the best informed commentators, said 2 days ago that he'd had a message from one source that says nothing has been put on the table, not even a proper sketch or the hint of a plan. Michel Barnier is reported to have said this week that the talks are in a state of paralysis. And the Finnish Minister for European Affairs, Titi Tuppurainen, said yesterday, and she is in the presidency of the EU, "We are willing to negotiate, but we cannot negotiate on something that is not existing." So I don't know who the Tories would actually believe on this. Because all the people who are involved in those discussions say the UK does not intend to bring to the table anything meaningful. But still, the Tories go on believing it. The third myth I'd like to explode is the fact that the Tories are in some sense a moderate party waiting and wishing for a deal. Graham Simpson gave the game away. Rather not Graham Simpson, because he is absolutely entitled to argue the extremist Brexit case. That is what he did, and he did it essentially as a spokesperson for the Brexit party. But the revealing thing was the applause he got from the Tory benches, from people I know are not extreme Brexiteers, but have now put themselves in that position. There are people on the Tory benches who will be able to ride out a no-deal Brexit because they have the money to do so. But there are wiser people on the Tory benches who know this will be a disaster for their constituents. And yet they applauded the extreme Brexit position. And why did they do that? Because Nigel Farage has taken over their party. That is essentially where things now are. There's no doubt about it at all. What has happened is that the Prime Minister is desperate to take Brexit party votes, and he has gone on to the Brexit party ground. They shake their heads, but they know it to be true, and they will particularly know it to be true if I can make a prediction about what will happen in any election. The Tories in Scotland will suffer major losses in that election because they've done that. And then the members here will look at the forthcoming Scottish Parliament election and say, oh dear, we have gone too far, but it would be too late. That is where they are going now, and they need to recognise they are going there. And if any of them have the convictions I believe they have, they want to change course now. And let me make a final point, Presiding Officer, about the issue of honouring the results of referenda. David Allen Green, one of the best commentators on Brexit, and I commend his Twitter feed to you and what he writes. David Allen Green made a very important point this week. He said a referendum can be democratic or irrevocable, but it can't be both. So when you have a referendum, the result is already changing because people are changing views and what they believe. So if you go on saying that that result stands forever and a day, it cannot by definition still be democratic. But that is what the Tories are saying. The Tories do not believe in any democratic choice at all. Because once a referendum has taken place, although referenda are utterly incompatible with their belief in sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament, once it's taken place, it's frozen in stone and we'll just do it. They don't believe that. They simply want Brexit. And the Scottish Tories want Brexit because they've been told to want Brexit by their leaders at Westminster. That is a tragedy. Today, this Parliament will vote to condemn a no-deal Brexit. It will vote to condemn the undermining of democracy that we've had from the Prime Minister, and it will send a message to that Prime Minister. The message the Scottish Tories will send to Boris Johnson is we are as supine as ever. We will just do as you tell us. Go on, tell us how high to jump, and we will jump. The trouble is, there's a fall coming for the Scottish Conservatives.
Oh, point of order, Jenny Mara, and then point of order, Jenny Mara first.
Today, during the drugs statement, Presiding Officer, at least 6 members who were due to ask questions, including myself, were not called because time ran out. If we are to properly hold government to account, can more time be allocated so there is sufficient time for proper scrutiny? Today's situation meant that no members from North East Scotland were able to raise the important Dundee Drugs Commission report with the Public Health Minister. In light of this, will the Bureau and the Government prioritise a debate on drugs death in government time at the earliest possible date so this Parliament can properly discuss and debate this public and human crisis?
Can I thank Ms Mara for the point of order? It is indeed a matter for the Bureau to decide the allocation of time. In this case, today, we were hard pushed for time. There was a lot of interest, I think partly because members are coming back following the recess with a lot of issues to raise. And I think all our debates and statements this week have been oversubscribed and we've struggled to get everybody in. I would point out that today I was conscious that I had selected both yourself and Mr Finlay to ask a question on drugs at First Minister's Questions. However, I also recognise that yourself and others, Polly McNeill and a number of members, including Stuart McMillan, who was lined up to speak, didn't get a chance to contribute. What I would say is that we're trying from the chair not to cut members off. Now, we're constantly trying to encourage members to keep their questions short and the answers short, but we're trying not to interrupt. So what we prefer is that members self-discipline, because if they don't, the members who are last on the list to ask questions or in the debate will have their time cut. So that's the balance we're trying to strike. Now, I also accept the general point that the Bureau, I'm sure, will bear it in mind that there was a lot of demand today on the drug statement and perhaps not quite enough time. So that point is noted, and I will take it to the Bureau. Rona Mackay, point of order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Liam Kerr, MSP, stated in Parliament on the 4th of September, the First Minister said last year that the Government would give criminal justice social work £100 million, which is a pledge that has been betrayed. However, the Independent Scottish Parliament Information Centre, SPICE, has confirmed that the Scottish Government has indeed allocated £100 million to criminal justice social work. If Liam Kerr is aspiring to become the next leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, he really does need to up his game. Presiding Officer, can you advise how he might go about correcting the record?
Thank you, Mr. Mackay. Yes, there are a number of ways. If a member does wish to correct the record, they can do so through the official report, or they can raise matters in the chamber or through written statements. However, the point that the member has been noted, and I'm sure the member will take account of it. Now, that concludes our debate on avoiding a no-deal exit from the European Union. The next item is actually decision time, and we've only got 2 questions today. The first question is that Amendment 18695.1 in the name of Donald Cameron, which seeks to amend Motion 18695 in the name of Michael Russell on avoiding a no-deal exit from the European Union, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 18695.1 in the name of Donald Cameron is yes 28, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The final question today is that motion 18695 in the name of Michael Russell on avoiding a no-deal exit from the European Union be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 18695 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 27, yes 87, no 28. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.